Welcome back to Views with Hughes, your Jennifer News. This is J.R.R. Hughes. Now, let's go ahead and get right into it. So, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power, Patrick McKay and J.D. Payne are still pushing the same false claim that they're staying true to J.R.R. Tolkien and his work in the second season of their Amazon MGM Studios show, okay? Now, back when they were promoting the first season back in 2022, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power, as you remember, kept insisting that they were following J.R.R. Tolkien's original material, but at the same time, they admitted that they were making significant changes to the J.R.R. Tolkien stories to fit their adaptations. In February of 2022, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power, actually explained to Vanity Fair that their main idea for Rings of Power was, can we create the book J.R.R. Tolkien never wrote and turn it into a massive modern stories that could only be done today? Now, this shows that the goal of the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power, was to invent new stories rather than sticking to the J.R.R. Tolkien original works, okay? Now, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power often talked about how much they respected J.R.R. Tolkien and his work and wanted to honor it. Yet these actions of the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power spoke louder than words, okay? The showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power added that the characters and storylines that weren't in J.R.R. Tolkien's books changed existing characters, backstories, and even altered some of the major events. Now, a lot of J.R.R. Tolkien fans noticed these changes and felt betrayed because, well, they were expecting the show that would closely follow J.R.R. Tolkien and his vision, but instead they got something that felt more like a modern reinterpretation on what an authentic adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, despite this whole backlash, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power continue to claim that they're being faithful to the J.R.R. Tolkien and his work, and this caused more frustration among J.R.R. Tolkien fans who see that the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power are not being honest about the direction that they've taken with the series itself. And I'll be honest, I was one of them too. Now, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power told the outlet we had discussions with the Tolkien estate. If we stick to exactly to the original text, we'd have a situation where our human characters die off every season because we'd be jumping forward 200 years in time. And this means we couldn't even meet the really big important characters until season 4. Now, sure, there might be some fans who want us to make a documentary style series about Middle Earth, but we're aiming to tell one continuous story that ties everything together. Cap. Now, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power continued. We think that in the end, the work will speak for itself. And it's like how before an orchestra performance starts, people in the audience talk to each other. But once the music begins, everyone is engrossed in the performance. Not everyone, honestly. But initially, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power said they were making significant changes to the J.R.R. Tolkien and his original work. However, when promoting the show at the San Diego Comic-Con back in 2022, as you remember, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power claimed that they were always referring back to J.R.R. Tolkien and his work, and we all knew that they were lying. Now, when asked to justify the inclusion of characters that were not originally created by J.R.R. Tolkien, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power explained, firstly, we always referred back to J.R.R. Tolkien's work. Secondly, when J.R.R. Tolkien's work didn't provide us with details, we tried to create new elements in a way that felt as authentic and true to the J.R.R. Tolkien style as possible. Okay, now, I got a problem with that because the fact of the matter is, basically, right here with that quote, they stated that J.R.R. Tolkien doesn't know what he's talking about, and he's the one that wrote the book in the first place. Now, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power would say, go back to the book, go back to the book, go back to the book. But while talking to Collider about the upcoming Rings of Power Season 2, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power explained it's powerful to see what people like, and it's clear. People love J.R.R. Tolkien. That's why J.R.R. Tolkien's work, next to the Bible and the Quran, is read all over the world with so many copies sold. So let's really focus on J.R.R. Tolkien and what draws people to his stories. Now, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power added, we had a plan from the start and we're sticking to it, and we have to stay true to what we believe in. And we all know, of course, that is a big lie, just another lie. Now, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power not only stuck to this claim that they were honoring J.R.R. Tolkien and his work, but the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power also contradicted themselves again while talking about sticking to their 5-year plan. You know, the 5 seasons for the Rings of Power on Amazon. The showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power said, we took this huge, ambitious project because we had a story we felt needed to be told. We were willing to dedicate a big part of our lives to telling it. The plan hasn't changed. Of course not. But the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power later explained most of the scripts for season 2 were already written before season 1 was even released. But we actually filmed season 2 after season 1 had aired. And this helped us learn a lot by seeing how people reacted to the first season and what they really liked about it. It wasn't really much, but I'll get into more details about that later. But the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power added, we make sure to read everything out there. We go through all the reviews, articles written by you, which is the media, and your colleagues in the media. And most importantly, we pay attention to what the fans are saying online. Now, we take all of this feedback seriously. Now, in The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power say that Sauron is back. And Galadriel kicked him out, so now Sauron has no army and no friends. Sauron has to be sneaky and smart to regain his power and make the Rings of Power, which Sauron plans to use to control everyone in Middle-earth. Now, the showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power added, building on the big ambitious first season cap, season 2 of Amazon's The Lord of the Rings of Power puts even the most loved and fragile characters into more trouble. They'll each have to find their way in a world that's getting darker and closer to disaster. Now, you got elves and dwarves and orcs and men, wizards and Harfoots. Friendships will be tested. Kingdoms will start to fall apart. And the good guys will have to fight even harder to keep what matters most to them, each other. Now, there are many things to unpack from this, but I can't help but remember that season 1 of The Rings of Power was a flop, resulting in only like 37% of the viewership that only stayed from the first episode of the season to the season finale. Not only that, but they also made up different characters that J.R.R. Tolkien didn't even create. And let's not forget that Amazon doesn't have the rights to all the Lord of the Rings, but they own only a few pages in the prologue of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. And since they only had rights to a few pages of the book, that's not even a part of the main story, then what is even the point in creating the show in the first place? I've always asked that question. Why would Jeff Bezos want to waste billions of dollars on that show that not only does it honor J.R.R. Tolkien, but is also based only on a few pages of the prologue of the book, and adding things that aren't even mentioned in the book or the Lord itself? It's simple. Jeff Bezos want his own Game of Thrones to compete with HBO. That's the waste of money. But hey, it's a waste of his money, and if he wants to be stupid, let him be stupid and waste his own money. Okay, so what do you think about the whole showrunners of The Lord of the Rings of Power, insisting that they're staying true to J.R.R. Tolkien's work, even though the first season didn't really stick to the story? So let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. Also, be sure to include any additional thoughts you might have of this particular topic. If you enjoyed what I shared in this video, go ahead, smash the like button, share far wide across social media. And if you haven't done so already and you enjoyed all the content that I put out there, go ahead, subscribe to the channel, click the bell notification so that way you're notified of future uploads and updates. Till then, peace.